No! I accept your challenge. So let's start from the beginning, y'all. First off, we need to create a cube to represent our basic person. I like to use this as a reference for scale later on because it's a little more understandable than something abstract such as a single meter. Again, at this point you should have gone File, Project window, and created a project which is going to be in your directory somewhere. Such as the Zfriends located in X week 1. It's going to create all these folders and they do various things. You can find them over here in, say, my projects, or in this case, week 1 is where I've set this project. And this is a really helpful technique in that you can, when you have this project set up, you can do something such as copy this whole Zfriends folder to your directory, or zip it and send it to somebody. And the whole thing will unpack and automatically have all of its links set and stuff. Different folders include scenes, which includes all your Maya files that you're going to be saving. Your source images, which is where you're going to have textures and stuff. Your images directory, which I think I might have actually done this wrong. Just quickly checking. So that creates a project directory. Now we have this default scene, and we want to set it up. First off, it's important to understand the units that you're working in. So if you go to Windows, Settings, Preferences, and over here in the Settings panel, you'll notice that it has working units of centimeter versus millimeter versus meter. We're working in centimeter and assuming that everything is 1/100th scale. So if something is 1 meter in real life, it's going to be represented in here as 1 centimeter. But basically 1 unit, as according to this grid. Now we need to create a human-sized object, which we can use as our basis for understanding our sense of scale in this scene. I like to create without any inputs, so I go to create polygon primitives and turn off interactive creation. This means that when you create a cube, it's going to be automatically in the center of our scene. How handy is that? I'm going to do this slightly different this time, I think. Now, right now this cube, which we will rename as person, is just existing over here in our outliner. Your outliner, as shown on this little hotkey, this little button which turns it into the perspective view plus the outliner, is just one object in your scene out of many. But we can use display layers to change how we find it and such. So I'm going to create a new layer called People. And now we can turn this layer on and off to control the visibility of our person. Our person currently has very clean transforms of translate and rotation and scale. And we want to maintain that. We want to say that this person is still at 0, 0, 0 at the point of the grid in the center, and not rotate at all, and just 1 person tall. But we want this person to also start off with his feet on the ground as the basis, and 1.8 meters tall. You can use the basic transforms to do this incorrectly by just moving this up, and say scaling this until he's about 1.8 meters tall. But we would like to do this the correct way, because right now you can see that these translations, rotations, and scales are now incorrect. So instead we will go into face mode. You can switch between modes using hotkeys such as F8, F9, F10, and F11 for object mode, vertex mode, edge mode, and face mode. You can also switch them somewhere up here. I don't know. I think it's hidden right now. Yeah, these buttons do it. But those are the dumb ways to do it. We want to do it the smart way. And the easiest way, in my opinion, is to right-click and just go face. If you get really good at this, you can start doing things like just immediately going to object mode and translate your stuff very fast. So I'm going to go into face mode now and switch to our multi-view perspective, our quad view, as it were. And first off, we need to make sure that this bottom plane, which represents our feet, is at the top of this grid, or rather at the 0 line of this grid. We could just move this around until it's correct, but we can also move it in more mathematically precise ways that's sticky to the grid by using grid snap. There's multiple ways to use this, but my preferred way is to hold X. And this means that while you hold X down, any translations you make are going to try and sticky to that. Now our foot plane is on the bottom of the ground. We now need to move our head plane up in the air a little more. So I can select it and move it up until it's about 1.8 meters tall for our default human. And then lastly, if you want to make this person a little broader than they are tall, or broader than they are deep, we can maybe select this front face and this back face, shift and left click will add to selection. And now we can scale these down like that. Now when we switch back into object mode, you'll notice that this person-sized cube has his feet on the ground, and when we move him, he'll stay on the ground, which is very handy. The next thing we need to do is make sure that we have our layout image available for us to work off of. The way you do this is by adding an image plane, and we want to add it to the top image, or to the top view. So what we're going to do is first select our camera with View, Select Camera. I don't think we needed to select it actually. But in this top view on the quad, we say View, Image Plane, Import Image. This is the same as going into the Attribute Editor, which you can switch between the Channel Editor and Attribute Editor, either using Control A, or I think one of these buttons does it. Ugh. So again, we have our selected camera, and we can also go into the top shape of the camera, and under environments, hitting create here is the exact same as saying View, Image Plane, Import Image. When we do this, we can go into our source images and find our floor plan. I believe I accidentally saved it in Images. But now we have this object that represents our ground plane. If you then want to select this image plane, you can go into the Perspective plus Outliner mode, and you can see it right here now as a created object. And we can move it, scale it, rotate it, as it were. The first thing that is wrong about this is the sense of scale, and this is where having that person representation is helpful. If this table is supposed to be, what is it? I think it's listed on the document. A 12-foot table, that's about 2 of these guys tall, or slightly under 4 units. We have to scale this up a fair amount. Sometimes objects are locked from being selected, so if you accidentally click off of this and you want to select your image plane, don't hesitate to turn back to your outliner to get it.
Can we come out of face mode? Sorry, obvious question.
To get out of face mode, you can right click and go to object mode,
Okay.
or I think you can hit F8, and I often hit F8 a whole bunch. It is not the most elegant solution in my opinion, but and they don't pay me to complain about Maya, but I do. So I'm going to scale this until it's about human sized, and I'm also going to aim for some arbitrary goals, such as having this sort of last line of perspective perhaps line up on a grid of this amount, which will be helpful when we're later creating things. Now let's start creating the ground plane for this floor plan. If I create a cylinder, there's going to be some immediate things I want to change in the attribute editor, or the channel editor. So if I toggle with Control A back to the channel editor, I can find this polycylinder input under the inputs. And if I click it, it expands to show the various ways in which this cylinder was created. I want this cylinder to have a radius about this much and a height of 0 because we want to start this on the floor. And here creates a new problem that we're going to cover shortly. And I want this to have 72 divisions, which is going to help later on when I have to extrude, say, this little face out of it. Again, good planning goes a long way. And then I want it to have 0 for the subdivision caps. But now we're seeing a different problem, which is that sometimes the 3D little pixely fairies that live in the computer don't know whether to draw the image plane or the 3D object. We can modify this just by moving this image plane around in 3D. So if I go back to this image plane, I can just move this slightly below. Actually, I'll move it slightly above. And then, now the problem is we can't see our grid. But if we Control A toggle between our channels and our attributes, we can now modify the alpha gain. Alpha refers in 3D to the transparency of a texture. So if I pull this down, now I can see through it a little bit. We have enough visibility that we can continue modeling, hopefully, but a small enough amount that it's not going to bug us as much. I might move that just slightly down a little more. So now if I go back to that polycylinder, I need to make this just a single plane. And the reason I do that is because I'm doing what's called edge modeling, wherein we're not working on a manifold object that slowly gets more detailed. Instead, we're modeling strips of polygons at a time. So I will select this top face, shift, right click, invert selection, and delete it. Now I will go to edge mode by right clicking and going upward to edge. And I can select these edges and begin to modify them to hit the different concentric rings of this room. If I double click on an edge, it will select the entire edge loop. I can also click on an edge and then shift double click to a neighboring edge loop until it gets all the way around. In the top view, I can scale this down until it's about the table's size to begin with, but this isn't our table. But this is a helpful division that we're going to have in our face somewhere. And then I can extrude this out to create the next concentric ring. Shift right click and extrude edge. This brings up a little widget, and this is modifiable to give you more control over your tool. For instance, you can click on this little power symbol to determine whether you are in last selected as the origin and orientation, or as the whole together, there are specific terms for this. Object versus world, I think. So this will use the entire world. And now I can switch to scale and scale it out. I'm going to do this again just to show you that there's always multiple ways to do the same thing in 3D. Shift, right click, extrude edge. Instead of doing that, I could click on this little square, which represents scale, or I could click on this circle, which represents rotation, or I could click on these arrows, which represent translation. And these will give that as the sort of dominant tool for this widget at the time. But I want scale right now, so I'll click on scale. And then I also want this to be, again, center oriented. So scale. And now I can click on this center one. I could scale from here while I'm still in the tool options. But also, you'll notice that when I click on one of these, it becomes highlighted. And whatever you have highlighted is actually the active tool, which means you can modify it at any given time by middle mouse click dragging. So if I middle mouse click drag right now, it's going to scale everything because the scale everything is selected. Very similarly, you can select channels in the channel box, or shift drag and select channels. And whatever's selected here in the channel box will be controlled when I middle mouse click drag in the 3D scene. Whoa! At this point, I'm going to switch to my quad view so I can see this in perspective. And I want to move this up as the stairs rise to the next level. So I will shift, extrude edge, and just grab these. And I actually don't want to drag these by hand. I want these to be a little more mathematical, so I'm going to use the input line to change how I move these. If you click on the actual icon, you can switch between absolute or relative transform. And we want to use relative right now. What absolute does is it assumes that whatever you type is going to place it on an origin point in this 3D axis. So if I say y of 0.5, it's going to be exactly at the 0.5 mark in grid space. If I say 1.5, it'll be exactly at that point in grid space. Instead, if you type that option with relative transform, it will be relative to the current selection's origin. So if I now type 0.5, you'll notice it went up exactly 0.5, but it was already at the 0 line, so that's misleading. If I type 0.5 again, it will go up 0.5 from where those edges previously were. I want this to be exactly 0.5 meters tall. And that is where the stairs are going to lead to the secondary level. Again, shift. With my edge loop selected here, I can shift and right click to get to extrude edge again. And from the top view, I'll again scale this out. And again, there's always multiple ways to do this. So instead of using those little scale buttons, I could use offset. No, not offset. Thickness? Yeah, thickness. So I could use thickness to change where this is. And this gets me to that next concentric circle. And I'll hit W to get out of that mode. Or, to just compare it one last time, shift and right click to get to extrude. I could instead grab all three of these and now do this from the channel box. Or I can manually type in 1.05. Yeah, we'll go with 1 point. Ooh, that was a mistake. And let me show you why. Which is, not all of these extrude out. This design has lots of sort of inset places. There's these sort of extruded parts here where the bonsai trees sit. There's these sort of cubbies where there's the cowls of retired heroes. There's this sort of monitor area. And so we need to extrude all these separately. I placed my initial cylinder with 72 divisions because it would allow me to more accurately select these. And by the way, I'm left clicking to select and shift left double clicking to add to selection from there to here. Similarly, I can shift left click once to select this, and now this is active as the newest thing I selected. And shift double click will add to there. This isn't always perfect. For instance, if I shift left click this one, and then I shift click this one by accident, so I have to unselect it and then select this. Now it doesn't have a context for what the last thing is selected. So if I shift double click here, it's not going to work. It's going to select everything instead. So I would have to reset the context of this selection tool by shift left clicking here, and now it's reset so I can shift double click, and it'll select there. So now that I have those selected, I will again extrude. Starting to look kind of floor-like, right? From the top view, I'm going to extrude out these sort of recesses for the monitor area and the doorway. So I can select these four and these four. And just for the sake of simplicity, we'll have them be the same. I will select Alt-E. Oh, wait, not Alt-E. Shift. Shift, right-click, and extrude edge. And now I'll immediately go into scale mode to set them to this top part. I'm going to scale them out till about where they're supposed to be. But these ones actually stop being round. So at this point, I might want to start using my grid again to get these correct. Having these all be linear now can be a pain in the butt. There's a couple ways you can do this. If you set it to absolute transform on scale, you would think that you could then type in y of 0 and have it scaled, or rather z of 0. But instead, it's always going to be absolute for scale. I don't know why this is. It's really dumb. But there is a secret way that you can get this functionality. And scaling to 0 is something that I do a lot in 3D. Instead, you can click up here, and this brings up this secondary tool idea. Where is it? The multi-component tool. This is the modeling toolkit. It's more advanced modeling features. And it has this different form of the basic translate, rotate, and scale tool. So if I click on this, it will now, where is it? It will now let me do transformed options from local, and I can set z of 0. Does that work? Let's check on the top view. There we are. So I can set it on the x-axis to 0. Similarly, x-axis of 0. Now I can move these on a grid scale to around there. And perhaps using relative transform on the x-axis, negative 0.5. No. The z-axis, negative 0.5. Nope. The z-axis, 1 now. That looks about right. This is all very mathematically precise stuff, but don't worry if it starts breaking or you're having problems. It's much more important to ship than anything else. I really think that mathematics stuff is useful later on, but if you don't turn in your final project, or like you weren't following along and you got stuck on this, and you got sad because you couldn't get the math to line up, so you stopped working on it, but then by the time you turn in the project, you got your math right, but you didn't finish the project. That's bad. So focus on trying to get all of the stuff done first. Make sense? And that's why we work in this linear fashion of production. We start with our pre-production problem of our design document and knowing what we have to make. We then start with the layout problem of making sure that there's at least a proxy object for everything and at least a basic layout option. And this is really handy when you have to finish your scene and you finish 9 out of your 10 objects, but there's still a chair represented by a shitty chair cube. That goes a long way towards saying, you know, you got pretty far. Shut. Again, my wife is pregnant, so I apologize, but I kind of have to check my phone if somebody texts me. Because you never know. So next up, I'm going to extrude out these cowl locations. I'm not sure how I want to do this. You can see on the design document that they didn't line up quite perfectly. But as I'm looking at this, I think I actually have to increase it, because if a human-sized person was wearing these cowls, and this is our human-sized person, we can tell that our scale is off now, because a human-sized person wouldn't fit in this. So based off of that, I'm actually going to select everything and scale this up a little bit. Say to about, we'll go about there, right? And I'll go into here, select my image plane, go back to my top view, and I'll scale my image plane up until it lines up with the new one. There. And so now if we use these two edges on every one of these, they're going to line up a little better. So I'm going to select that. I'm holding shift and left clicking to add to selection for all of my cowls. And again, there's always a different way to model. I think the way I did this last quarter was actually different. Instead, I just modeled 1/6 of this and then duplicated it around radially, which is very hard to do in Maya. And now I can scale these out. If I double click on this scale tool, it brings up the tool settings over here, and I can change some of the basics of it. So if I switch it to local, no. What is the setting? Actually, I think this is something where I want to use the modeling toolkit. So if I go to the scale over here, oh no, I remember. It's none of those. What it actually is I want to go to mesh, edit mesh, transform components, and that's going to let me modify all of these individually. So if I then scale on the x-axis, it's assuming each of them is sort of their individual pivot point. And now I can extrude with shift right click, extrude edges. I'll scale it out a bit to start with, but then I will do the same thing, edit mesh, transform components, scale it down. I actually could have done, I forgot about my scale problem and these needing to be a little bigger, so I'm going to right click, shift, double click to add to selection and edge loop in entirety. And again, edit mesh, transform components. So there's our basic floor layout, right? And now we need to have walls, which we will do after a short break, because I